Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Susan Goldin-Meadow. She is the Beardsley Ruml Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Psychology and Committee on Human Development at the University of Chicago. She has made pioneering contributions to the study of how language is created and learned, and how the gestures that go along with speech facilitate learning and communication. And today we're focusing on her book, Thinking with Your Hands, the surprising science behind how gestures shape our thoughts. So Dr. Goldin-Meadow, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So just to introduce the topic and your book here, what is the premise of your book and why are you interested in gestures?
So that's a little bit of a long story. I'm interested in gesture because of where I began. I was interested in where language comes from, and whether there is something about language that we ourselves contribute to, or whether language is just handed down from generation to generation to generation. So if language disappeared, and if it's handed down from generation to generation to generation, it might not return, and it might not return in the same way. But if language disappeared and we contribute to language learning, then it might not only return, but return in the same way. So I wanted to study that question. It's not an easy question to study, but I wanted to study it. And so the people I looked at were deaf children of hearing parents. So they couldn't acquire spoken language, and they were not exposed to a sign language. And I found that they started to use their hands to communicate. So I spent many years, my first years of my career, studying these children to try to figure out whether what they did with their hands could be called language. And from there, I got interested in how all people use their hands, whether or not they're creating their language or learning their language.
But is it that these children started using their hands, through their own initiative spontaneously, or was it through some sort of instruction?
No, they weren't instructed at all.
No.
The instruction they were getting was in spoken language. Their parents are hearing, and their parents really wanted them to learn how to speak. So that they were given instruction in speech by their parents, and by the schools that they went to, oral schools. But in fact, what they ended up communicating with was their hands.
And so we'll get more into that later on in our conversation, but just to take a small step back, what can we communicate through gesture exactly?
Well, I don't think, okay, so gesture can be made into a language.
Okay.
That's what the deaf kids do. But for the most part, when we gesture, we're using our gestures to sort of shade our language. We can just add nuance to our language, or we can add ideas that aren't conveyed in our language at all. So it depends. It can contribute quite a lot. And whether or not you pay attention to it, it depends on the listener. Most people do pay attention to it.
But here, when we talk about gestures, there are some other non-human animals that use gestures, right? Are you interested in those as well, or just in humans?
Well, I think that it's an interesting question as to whether or not other non-human animals use gesture. They do. Whether they're the same, whether they're used in the same way. I'm actually collaborating with some people who study non-human primates to figure out whether these animals use gesture, whether the forms of their gestures look the same as hearing people's forms, whether the meanings look the same. Mostly what non-human primates do is use gesture to make requests, to ask for things, to ask to be tickled, to ask, be chased or whatever. Whereas at least the deaf children that I'm studying use gestures to just talk, not to talk, to communicate, to just convey ideas, to schmooze, to have a conversation. And that's a little different from non-human primates.
And is there also differences in terms of, I mean, I guess that you've already ended up mentioning that there, but are there big differences in terms of the kinds of gestures? Perhaps not really, I'm not referring exactly to their meaning, but to the kinds of gestures that we tend to use and the gestures that other non-human animals use.
Yeah, ours are much more elaborate than their
Mhm.
gestures. I mean, they don't do things like that. They, I am beginning to study with Kat Hobiter, who studies non-human primates, the forms that these creatures make. And whether they look like the forms of the gestures. I mean, they have different hands, so they're not going to be identical. They have different bodies, they have different, but we wanted to see just how comparable they would be in the situations in which they use these gestures. So we're beginning to look at that.
So I guess that an interesting question here to ask is, why do we gesture at all? And by we, I mean humans. Why do we gesture at all when we already have language? I mean, is it that gestures add something to language? What are the functions of gestures exactly?
Well, that's a great question. No, we know that one of the things gesture does is it does communicate information to listeners, but it does much more than that, because if you're blind, you will gesture. If you have never, ever, ever seen anybody gesture, nonetheless, you will move your hands when you talk, which feels like it's pretty robust and pretty resilient and tied to language in some way. So I think a gesture has a function both for the speaker and also for the listener. It does lots of good things for the speaker. It organizes thoughts, and it helps you attend, it helps you remember, helps you keep things online, but it also does many good things for listeners as well.
And I guess that in the case of people who are blind and use gestures, in that specific case, it is very evident that they're at least also using them for themselves because they cannot see exactly what they are conveying to other
Right,
people, right?
and we've even looked at blind children or blind adolescents talking to other blind speakers, and they gesture. So they know they can't be and they know they're talking to a blind person. So they can't be thinking, oh, well, they could be looking at me. It's not, really feels like, so when we gesture on the phone, which everybody does, you think, well, okay, gestures are not for the listener, but sometimes that's just habit. You just do it. Whereas for the blind, it feels more impressive.
But so for the person who's talking or gesturing, what kinds of cognitive effects can it have when it comes to themselves? I mean, does it have any cognitive benefits to gesture?
Sure. I mean, we found that it does actually lower your cognitive load, so you can remember more if you gesture. It will help you retain the information that you have expressed if you express it not only in speech, but also in gesture. It will guide your own attention. You will look in particular places. So it really does have cognitive, and we're trying to look more at cognitive effects that gesture has. Both, why do we do it? What are the cognitive skills that we need to gesture? And once having gestured, what effect does it have on our cognition?
And what kinds of, let's say, additional or different information can other people get from our gestures? I mean, beyond what we say.
So I think in the past, most people still, I think about gesture as conveying attitude and emotion, that it gives you away in the sense that it expresses how you feel about yourself, about the other, about the content. But what I've been focusing on is not just how you feel about the conversation, but its contribution to the conversation itself. So substantive information that gets conveyed in gesture that might not be conveyed in your speech.
And so, I mean, because we are using parts of our bodies, I guess that most of the part our hands, but also other parts of our bodies, does it connect in any way? Or, I mean, does your work on gestures connect in any way to embodied cognition? Is that a framework that you also bring into your work?
So yes, I do think that the fact that gestures use the body is important. I have done some work comparing if you gesture, you talk about a math problem and you gesture pointing to the numbers, as opposed to moving the numbers around, literally taking plastic numbers and moving them around. So an action, which is also embodied, what you find is that the effects of gesture are different from the effects of action. So both of them can help you learn, but what gesture does is it helps you generalize that knowledge and extend it not only in this problem here, but to other problems that are like it. And action is much more limited in that sense. It ties you down, and both are embodied. So what I'm really saying is that gesture, yes, is embodied, and that's important, but it's not the whole story.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about the learning aspect here. So how do speakers use gestures when learning a new concept, for example?
Well, it depends.
Mm-hmm.
I think what can happen in a classroom is they may express their understanding of the problem and then give a slightly different level of understanding with their gestures. So once having done that, if the teacher can pick up on that, she might teach to that. He might teach to that understanding, that implicit understanding, and then the child can learn more from having gotten that input. Another way to do it is just when the kids gesture, I think that improves their understanding. Gesturing itself makes them think differently.
And can learners also express ideas about concepts in their gestures that cannot be found in their speech?
Yes, definitely. It could be found. It's not that they're not expressible. It's just that that person doesn't have articulated knowledge of the concept. So I can give you an example from a study that we've done of children learning about number. So this is a task that I took from Jean Piaget. So he gave children 2 rows of checkers, asked the children if there was the same number of checkers in one row and the other. They say, yes, of course. You spread out 1 row of checkers. And then he asked the children, is that the same number of checkers in both rows? And some kids who were non-conservers at a certain age say, no, it's a different number. So that's what we've studied. We've looked at kids who say no. They all say no. But some kids say no, and they, when you ask them why, they express the same information in their gestures and their speech. So they'll say, it's different because you move them, and they'll show the moving with their gestures. Other kids will say, it's different because you moved them, and they'll pair up the gestures in the 2 rows with their hands. That's not how you moved it. In fact, it's a pretty clever thing to have done, because what it does is it shows, if you follow that through, that there are the same number of checkers in one row and the other row. So, and it turns out that the children who produce those different gestures from their speech are the ones who are more likely to learn than the other children. So that's a case where they're saying something. They're talking about sort of how the gestures can pair up in their gestures, in their hands. I'm sorry, how the checkers can pair up in their hands, but how the checkers were moved in their mouths.
Could you give us, just to illustrate what we're talking about here, another example, but now about how children or other older students can learn through gestures in the classroom specifically?
Well, I think what we have done in experiments is we've told children to gesture in a particular way. And when you do that, they learn. Then they're more likely to learn than if you don't tell them to gesture. And in those studies, what we did was we gave them particular gestures to do. But we've also done studies where we tell the kids, okay, next time you do this, move your hands. And they do that, and they're more likely to learn. So even if we don't tell them exactly what gestures to make, they're still more likely to take advantage of the instruction that they're getting. So it helps.
And do we have any idea about what are the specific, let's say, cognitive mechanisms operating there? I mean, is it that the gestures themselves play a role in the learning, or is it that by gesturing, they are perhaps paying more attention to what they're learning?
Well, those are not as different as I would, as I
Mhm.
think you mean. I mean, I think that what the gestures could do is
Yeah.
just reflect what they know,
Okay.
and somebody else can respond back to them. And that's one way in which they can play a role in learning. But the
Mhm.
other way is that they could actually change the way the child is thinking. I think we have some evidence that that's true, but we still don't know how it's changing the way the child
Okay.
or the learner. I don't think this is about children. I think this is about people.
Mhm.
So you too will gesture, might help you learn. So gesture, it's good for you. But we don't exactly know what it's doing. We're trying to do some brain analyses and studies of scanning the brain when you're gesturing, and to see if we can figure out exactly what gesture is doing. It may be helping you abstract. It may be helping you pull away from the concrete details and helping you move out away from the particular and therefore generalize better.
Mhm. And so, on the other hand, we've been talking about learning, but on the other hand, can gestures we use have a detrimental effect on us and others if they convey, for example, incorrect information? I mean, can they hinder our learning?
Well, certainly they can hinder our learning. We've created studies where, we make people pick up gestures that don't help. They actually get in the way. I think what gestures are is powerful. So that we have an example of a teacher inadvertently pointing out all of the numbers in the problem when she didn't really mean to. And what the child did after that was add up all of the numbers in the problem. He just got waylaid by the person's gestures. I think gestures are really powerful. And given that they are powerful, they will affect you for good if they're moving in a good direction, and they can affect you for bad if they're going to take you in a bad direction.
And I mean, earlier I've asked you whether gestures add additional information to what we're saying, what we're talking about. But then, do the non-verbal aspects of communication influence how observers interpret what someone is saying?
I think they definitely do, but we don't always realize it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when we were first studying these gestures, we would write down, what we thought the kid was saying,
Yeah.
and gesturing. And then we decided, okay, maybe we should separate these and write down what the kid is saying, listening only to speech, and then write down what the kid is gesturing, looking only at gestures. And when we did that, that's when we discovered there was different information. I think when you listen and you look, you integrate instantly. You just you put that information together in your mind, and you don't remember where the information came from. So we're very good at taking in gestural information, and I think it's hard not to use it.
And so,
Go ahead.
no, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say there's one of my students, Anjana Chandran, is now looking at gestures in social evaluative situations, where she asks people to evaluate groups that are, either popular or not popular, competent or not competent, whatever. And so she found that occasionally what people will do was say one thing, but gesture something quite different. So they'll say, men and women are equally good learners or equally good leaders, and they'll say, well, men women are just as good learners as men. And they'll set them up where they'll start talking about women and place their hand low down in their face. When they talk about men, they'll place their hand up near their forehead. So that by situating these two groups on this vertical plane in different places, they're not talking about equality, not with their hands. They're talking about equality with their words, but not with their hands. And that is going to influence the listener. We're doing some studies now to see if it does influence the listener. And it does.
With that example in mind, does that reveal any sort of unconscious biases on the part of the speaker or the gesturer?
I think it does. And I think they might be very unconscious. That is, I'm not sure that the speaker even knows that he or she did that. They may really think, I believe in the equality of leadership in males and females. But by putting your gestures in that way, you don't totally believe it. But I'm not sure that they're trying to hide it. I think they don't know it.
So it might not be done intentionally, right?
Right. I don't think any of these, okay, there are gestures that are done intentionally. If I put my thumb up and I say it's great, or if I do an okay thing, those are intentional gestures.
Okay.
All of these other ones are not. We just move our hands. And I don't think that we really think hard about how we're gesturing. And it may be important that we don't think hard about our gesturing, that it just comes out, and that it's its naturalness and implicitness that is part of why it's powerful.
But can people use their gestures to influence others and how they interpret what they're saying?
You mean do it explicitly and intentionally?
Yes.
I'm sure you can. Absolutely. Politicians try to. They're very bad at it because they're not very good at gesturing. You'd have to be a skilled gesturer, I think, to use your gestures. Okay, here's an example.
Okay.
Amanda Gorman, who gave that wonderful speech at Biden's inauguration. She used her hands beautifully. And she used them. She was very intentional, I think, about her gestures, because they were used almost as a choreography. They were just choreographed movements that went along with her words. But I think she thought about them before. I don't know that, but I think she thought about them beforehand and actually used them to further elaborate and bring to mind images. Storytellers do that too. When they tell stories, they use their gestures to sort of make it more alive and to convey nuances that they don't convey with their hands. With their
Yeah, I was asking you that because I was just thinking that if gestures can influence how other people interpret what we're saying and the kinds of information they get from what we are communicating, perhaps if someone was aware of that and they wanted to actually manipulate people, perhaps they could add that to what they're communicating verbally.
Yeah, they could. I think, but what I'm saying back is that you'd have to be skilled to do it. Okay, because it's not trivial to, I do think that's what politicians try to do, but they're not good at it. And most of them look sort of silly. And you can see when their gestures don't match their speech and when they're trying to, it just doesn't look so great. So I think you could, influence people by gesturing in a particular way, but to make it look natural so that people wouldn't necessarily pick up on it, you'd have to be good.
Great. So let's get back to deaf children then and how they use home signs. So first of all, how do you study home signs? How do you go about it? And is it something that children who are deaf just invent themselves, or how does it work exactly?
So the way we have studied it is just by going into children's homes when they're little, and asking the parents if we can videotape the kid and just put down a bunch of toys and let the kid play with the parent or with one of us, and we videotape the child. And the kid does what every kid does, sort of play with the toys and talk about or gesture about the toys. So in this case, now whether every single deaf child will do that, I don't know. I don't think it matters at some level. The fact that any deaf child can do that, given very little, no sign language input, is sort of the point that I wanted to make. It is doable. It's possible. We can as children construct at least the fundamental aspects of language, even if we haven't experienced it.
Mhm. But these home signs that deaf children or some deaf children use, do they have similarities to language in terms of, for example, the semantics and the structure of the language, or no?
Right. So I think in both ways, when they're little kids, they gesture about the same things that hearing kids talk about when they're learning spoken language, and deaf kids sign about when they're learning sign language. So, it's what they're thinking about. So that's the content of their communications, but they also have very simple structural rules as well. So their gestures are in a particular order. If they want to talk about an object that's being acted upon, they'll point or indicate that object before they do the gesture for the action. If they want to say that something is being moved to a place, they'll do the action for the moving, and then they'll indicate the place. And that tends to be true in all of the children we've looked at, and in children in different cultures. So we've looked at kids in America, and we've looked at kids in Turkey, and we've looked at kids in China, and they all use the same structures, which is interesting.
Yeah, and so the syntactic structure there is object and then verb instead of verb plus object,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
As we actually find in some spoken languages, like Japanese, I guess, the object comes before the verb.
And as in Turkish is one, but the Turkish kids are no better at it than US kids. Okay. So here's a fact that you might not know. If we tell people, adult people who use Turkish and Chinese and Spanish and English to just be quiet and create gestures, okay, they will invent gestures strings that have the object in front of the verb, even if they're English speakers, even if they're Spanish speakers. So when you ask them to describe it in English, they'll put the verb in front of the object, of course, because we say, I ate the apple, or I beat the drum. But when they describe it in gestures, they'll indicate the drum first and then do beating. They'll indicate the apple first and then do eating. And all of the groups are the same.
So, do you think that studying gestures can also tell us something about how language works? I mean, how spoken language works, and perhaps how the cognitive apparatus behind language processes information?
So, okay, that's a question that I have studied less. I'm much more interested in the developmental processes that create language than in the processes that we use when we produce or receive language. What I do think is interesting about the deaf children, the home signers, is that they really don't have an experience of receiving the language, that is comprehending, because they don't see it. So they are, in a way, a production machine. They're expressing their thoughts, but they don't comprehend those same ideas from somebody else's language. So I think they can bear on questions of production and comprehension because of that fact. But I haven't really studied and don't know so much about processing of these things. Although, comparing how sign languages are processed compared to spoken languages can do that, can be very helpful.
And do we know if the gestures that deaf children use are in any way similar to the ones used by hearing children?
I've looked at that at the very, very beginning. Hearing children also use their gestures very explicitly. They'll point at objects. They create some iconic gestures. They rarely put two gestures together, hearing children. But the deaf children do all the time. So the deaf children go much farther with their gestures than the hearing kids do.
But what do these home signs really look like? I mean, are they similar to mimicry? Do they replicate actual movements of an event, or something else.
Yeah, they're not mimicry, much
Mhm.
to my surprise. I mean, they're not a total mime. They don't look like Marcel Marceau, who's a wonderful mime. You know, so to represent eating an apple, they wouldn't sort of go into a whole event of picking up the apple and shining it on their shirt and then eating it. They want to talk about eating an apple, they'll point at the apple and then do a little jab toward their mouth. So they break up these events into small pieces. And once having broken up the events into small pieces, then you got to put it back together again. And that's where the structure comes in.
And in terms of the functions, because earlier in our conversation, I asked you about the functions of gestures more generally. What functions do home signs serve?
Well, home signs serve the function of language. I mean, these
Mm.
kids have no other way of communicating other than body language and, you know, picking up, I mean, acting. So these gestures actually serve the functions of language. And in fact, for many of the kids, it really serves all of the functions of language, so that they'll use it to talk to themselves. So they'll produce gestures that are conveyed, not for you, just for me, the kid. Or they'll use gestures to point at their other gestures in sort of a meta-linguistic way. You know, kid makes a face of Donald Duck and I'm not watching it, so he points at his face to indicate, I said Donald Duck, you know, by pointing at his own gestures. Those are pretty sophisticated functions. They tell stories with their gestures. You know, they string lots of gestures together and make a story. So there's lots of, they comment, they request, they use them for generics. There's all kinds of ways in which these gestures fulfill the functions of language.
So in hearing people, when many times, for example, we have internal speech, or when we think out loud to ourselves, do home signers or deaf children use gestures or their home signs the same way?
Yeah, I think that's what the kids are doing when they're talking to themselves. So I have an instance when the child is trying to create a block tower. And there's a little sheet that tells you which blocks to put on the tower. And so he looks at it and does an arc gesture with his hand. So I helpfully went and got an arc gesture, an arced block, and he just ignored me. That gesture wasn't for me. It was really for him to go and find an arc block. So it was, in that case, not intended to communicate to anybody other than himself.
Mhm. But if home signs serve the same functions as language, are home signers ever able to entirely recreate language or not?
So not as I mean, who knows really? I doubt it. I think that what home sign invents, home sign includes many of the really basic aspects of language, simple.
Mm-hmm.
But we have been able to explore the changes that home sign undergoes when you bring home signers together into a single place. That happened in Nicaragua 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Deaf people were brought together for the first time. And what happened is that then they could see each other's gestures and produce each other's gestures. And a language started to form, Nicaraguan Sign Language. And as new people enter that community, that language is learned by others and is changed and is changed and is and it's still changing. You know, so that's when we're going to get a full-blown sign language. That's how all sign languages evolve, actually, over time. So I don't think home signers can invent all the properties of language. And I think it's very interesting to try to distinguish which properties they can invent and which properties require this transmission and other aspects of the world to be developed.
So another thing that you also talk about in your book is can knowing how the hands communicate help us better understand people?
Well, I think it can help us understand what people are thinking. And that's pretty good, you know. I think there are examples, you know, if you're a clinician, probably, or therapists, probably what you're doing is making use of what people do with their hands to make inferences about what they're thinking. You may be doing it consciously, or you may be doing it unconsciously. But if you're a good therapist, I think you're using those kinds of thoughts that are displayed in the air. So in that sense, we can understand people better.
And can it connect to parenting in any way? I mean, can gestures have some sort of, I don't know, influence in parenting and our parenting practices?
Right. Well, I think it can in many ways. One way is in how you respond to your kid. So, for example, if the kid points at a cup and says, "Mommy," the kid obviously doesn't think the cup is a mommy. I mean that, but probably what the kid is saying is that's mommy's cup. And so if you as an adult say to the child afterwards, "Oh yeah, that's mommy's cup," what you're doing is translating what the child produced in gesture and speech into speech. And you're giving the child an opportunity, a really golden moment in which to learn how to say that. So that if you attend to your child's gestures and sort of respond to them, as most parents, I think, do, that may improve their learning. And they may learn that faster than they would have without the parent responding in that way.
And so do you think that, and also going back to something that we talked a little bit about earlier, do you think that your work can also apply to education? And if so, in what ways?
So I think in all of these ways, it's sort of the same. And I think it definitely can and should be applied to education. When children or when learners are asked to explain what they know, they gesture. And those gestures may reflect ideas that are not coming out of their mouths. So a good teacher will look at that and say, "Oh, okay, I maybe not consciously, but they'll realize that the child understands that." So one of the things you can do is ask your kids to gesture. Sort of say, when you explain that problem at the board, "I want you to gesture while you're doing it," because that may reveal more. You can use it for diagnosis in a sense. Use it to figure out what the child knows. Right. So, and in addition, it can be used, the teacher can gesture and teach the child things through his hands. So there's both give and take, both the children's gestures. You can encourage them to gesture, and you can watch your own gestures and make sure you don't mislead them with your gestures.
And do you think, and I guess this is also important in the context of education, do you think that by studying gestures and having a better understanding of how children use them and how they develop over time, that we can better identify children who have diverged in their development in terms of communication and perhaps potentially helping them get back on course, so to say?
Well, we do have some, I think, important analyses of kids who are brain injured. Okay, so they're brain injured. They're all at the very bottom of the heap in terms of when their ability to produce words at 18 months.
Yeah.
But in fact, the two groups differ very much. They differ in how much gesture they produce. So half of them are also at the bottom of the heap with respect to gesture. And some are at they're just like regular kids with respect to their gestures. Okay. Then we fast forward, a year or two, and we look at their word learning at that point. And the kids who are at the bottom of the heap, remember, they were all at the bottom for word learning to begin with, but the ones who didn't gesture stayed at the bottom. And the ones who did gesture improved. And so their word learning then went into the normal range. So that's a case where we can use gesture to diagnose who might need intervention. It's those kids who are not gesturing and not speaking, or speaking very little, who really could use more intervention than the kids who are gesturing and not speaking.
And so still in regards to education, and this will probably be my last question today, Can that also apply to students from less privileged backgrounds? I mean, can we also see those divergences between students who come from less privileged backgrounds in comparison to the other students who come from more privileged backgrounds, or not?
Well, I have one of my former students, Becky Church, has done studies of kids who are come from lower SES families, low-income families. And she has found that gesture is actually even more important for them. So if you give them gestures in their input, in their instruction, as opposed to, kids who come from higher income families, you can wipe out the differences or at least get closer to leveling the playing field if you include gesture. So without gesture, they look really different, but with gesture, you begin to equate. So it may be even more important for kids from lower income families. And the problem, of course, is with online instruction is that gesture isn't always included in it. And if it's particularly important for kids who are not there yet, that they're getting sort of a double whammy by not being able to see the gestures that the teacher produces.
So that's potentially another way by which during the pandemic, by having online classes, children's learning might have been impacted.
Maybe. I mean, I don't think it's the biggest reason. There are plenty of reasons.
Yeah. No, sure.
But I think it may have contributed in some ways. I mean, the fact that information is being conveyed by hands and the kids aren't seeing it, but it works in both ways. When the teacher is sitting in her little box and the kid is in his little box and the teacher can't see the kid's hands, she's not getting insight into what the kid is saying. And then conversely, if the kid isn't able to see the teacher's gestures, they're not getting that input from the teacher. So.
Yeah, so just one more question then, because I was almost forgetting about asking you this specifically. So, and what about neurodivergent children, like autistic children? Do we see differences in terms of how they use gestures and how the other, more regular children use gestures?
Yeah, so I haven't studied this myself, but I have a former student, Jana Iverson, who has studied autistic kids and Down syndrome kids, and other people have studied Williams syndrome kids. And autistic kids are said to gesture less than typically developing children. They certainly produce fewer of the kinds of gestures that we recognize as gestures. They may, because they do a lot of nonverbal touching and whatever, maybe some of those really are gestures and require somebody to really look hard at them. People have also looked at how parents use gestures in relation to these kids. And the parents' gestures are pretty comparable across kids. So it's not like the parents are, but sometimes, the parents are changing their gestures in ways that might not be so helpful. So I think that kind of work is really very useful to do.
Great. So, Dr. Goldin-Meadow, I think that this is a good point for us to wrap up the interview. And the book is, again, Thinking with Your Hands, the surprising science behind how gestures shape our thoughts. And I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And just before we go, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
On my website, but I don't remember its name. Send it to you and you can put it on.
No, look, no problem at all. I will look it up and
Yes,
include it in the description.
I'm one of those. I don't know what technology, but they can find me. University of Chicago, that's where I am.
Okay, great. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. I really loved the book, and I loved our conversation today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your interest. I really appreciate it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles de Moray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.